Yes, thanks. I'm Alan Hall. I'm the Director of the Labor Studies program at the university and also involved in the Workers' Center. And just before I start, just let me tell you that the Workers' Center, some of you may know, has just started a wage theft campaign. The Workers' Center is interested in advocating on behalf of vulnerable workers, non-union workers. And the wage theft campaign is aimed at trying to put more pressure on employers to abide by the rather limited employment rights that people have. So if anybody's interested in that campaign, we're looking for volunteers and people who want to get involved in it, and we're distributing things, flyers, information flyers to employers, bar and restaurant employers in particular, tomorrow evening starting at 6 at the Workers' Center, which is 328 Palliser. What Jeff has just said does fit in very well with what I was going to say, even though we didn't talk, so it's always nice to... Pure magic. Yeah, pure magic. Because the question I was asking, I wanted to address here, are really two questions, really. Why is the occupation movement important to labor, or potentially important to labor, as well as why is labor important to the Occupy movement? Now, the second question actually relates quite well to, I think, what Jeff was saying, in as much as ultimately the Occupy movement, I agree wholeheartedly that it doesn't matter entirely whether or not particular sites last for 2 years, 2 months, or 2 weeks, but rather the extent to which it does lead to much broader and wider mobilization. In the final analysis, the Occupy has certainly had a short-term impact on political discourse and has moved at least some people, I think, back to a position where they're a little more conscious and aware of inequality in particular and the immense size of that problem. But to move to a position of how we're going to do something about it is, of course, another matter, and that's really where we need to go now. And for that, I'd have to say that my view is that ultimately labor movement is critical or essential, and not only labor movement but workers more generally. It's quite clear that one of the things that the Occupy movement has done has in a sense expressed the extraordinary frustration, anxiety that workers are feeling, because of course one of the big things that underlies the successes that the movement has had, I think, are the incredible problems that people have been having over the last 15, even 20 years, but also certainly more so in the last 10 years, with just getting half-decent jobs that are no longer available, that would have been available perhaps at least 20 or 30 years, particularly for working class people, but also even for middle class. And the young people, of course, are also experiencing this very problem, graduating with degrees that they find are ultimately of less worth than they thought, and always being encouraged to get some additional education just in order to get a very nominal or minimal job. Why is the Occupy movement important to labor? Well, I think it obviously relates to what I just said in terms of the decline of work and employment conditions. Labor movement is in serious trouble, and David Camfield and other scholars in labor have certainly been making these arguments over the last 10 years that the labor movement in Canada, as well as the labor movement in the US and really globally, is in crisis. It is unable, in many respects, to maintain the conditions of employment that it's negotiated for its workers. Most unions are now in concession mode. That is, they are, if they're lucky, they're able to sort of maintain the wages that they have. Many of them are losing their pensions, their benefits. They're losing control over their work, which is a fairly significant thing, often in trade for simply keeping their job for another 3 years. Unions, as a consequence, are losing members in large numbers. The proportional representation of Unions in this country have been going down steadily for the last 10 or 15 years, particularly in the private sector. In the public sector, unions as well have been under increasing amount of attack, as demonstrated with the postal workers in the last while. And of course are losing their jobs in large numbers to privatization. And of course, workers themselves are also finding that their employment is eroding in a significant way. A large number of workers, of course, are now working in non-union contexts. And many of them, of course, are also working in temporary, part-time, and generally precarious forms of employment. All of which, of course, means that they are less and less able to defend themselves in terms of the limited conditions they do have. One of the things that prompted us to start our wage theft campaign is our discovery that increasingly many people are not being paid the wages that they earn, the limited wages that they earn, that they're getting ripped off increasingly by employers that are emboldened by the fact that workers are so powerless. So ultimately, from labor movement's point of view, the Occupy movement offered an opportunity for them to, I think, recognize and bring back the idea, that the notion that in particular the kind of economic policies that have been been predominant in the last 10 or 15 years, and of course I'm talking about neoliberalism and free trade and globalization, have been a disaster for certainly the working class. Now, part of the problem, of course, is that labor movement has been unable to mobilize its members. And that's also, to some extent, evident, I think, in the somewhat ambivalent support that labor movement has given to the Occupy movement. Some unions have been fairly active, and others haven't. Whether or not they've been given as much support as they could or should in order to maintain the kind of impact the Occupy movement is having is another question. I think some of the losses that are going on now in terms of evictions and so on probably reflects the fact that the union movement has not been taking as strong a position as they probably could. And that reflects, I think, the capacity or the lack of capacity that union movement has to mobilize its members to support these kinds of things. As soon as the media started to turn against the Occupy movement, instead of defending the Occupy movement, the labor in many respects backed off. And that's a reflection of their weakness. And it's also a reflection, obviously, of the need for significant renewal in the labor movement. And there have been various kinds of things that have been happening in the last several years to try and move that forward, but there still is an awful lot to do. And certainly in the final analysis, it does mean, though, that if there are elements within labor that can work with movements like Occupy Windsor, they're much stronger together than they are by themselves. And in that sense, I certainly hope that there is that kind of effort to sustain this over the longer term. Ultimately, labor's not going to be able to succeed without the support of other movements, but there is no way that any movement in this country is going to do, or any country is going to succeed without the support of workers. Ultimately, because as Jeff points out, we're talking class here. It's not just a question of getting the state to be nicer to us. Ultimately, it's about capitalist class and the amount of power they have under the current system. And the only ones who can significantly challenge capitalism are the workers. And so we really do have to understand the absolute requirement that any movements that have a hope in hell of achieving any change must make linkages with workers. And the reverse is also true.